After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. Today I'm here with Dr. Emma Shortis, Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, for our 100th episode of After America. Emma, we made it.
Us and David Attenborough, hey?
Yeah. One of the other shows I produce for the Australia Institute Dollars and Cents, the co-host Eleanor Johnston-Leake would, I think, ask me to put air horns in at this point, but I might save the more demure, more mindful and demure listeners of After America that particular experience. So, Emma, we're celebrating today with your favourite thing, and that's maths. And that's because we've published some new polling about Australians' views of Trump and the US relationship. So, Emma, what do Aussies think about our mate Don?
They're not super hot on him, I've got to say. Yeah, we've got some pretty interesting results that have changed a fair bit since last time we polled Australians about how they feel about the alliance and Donald Trump. We asked Australians who they thought was the greatest threat to world peace, Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, or Xi Jinping, president of China. And 52% of Australians said that they thought Donald Trump was the greatest threat to world peace.
Ouch.
Yeah, only 17% chose Putin and only 16% chose Xi, which I thought was particularly interesting, kind of given, you know, the rhetoric that we always talk about around China in particular. I think Putin kind of makes sense because, you know, that unfortunately, I guess, that war has really fallen out of the news and lots of Australians would see that as, you know, very far away from us. But yeah, so a majority think that Donald Trump is a greater threat to world peace than the leaders of the world's two most powerful authoritarian states, which, I don't know, feels significant.
Yeah, particularly for two countries who are supposed to, you know, supposedly share values. It turns out if you go around starting wars.
Yeah, illegal ones. Yeah, people react.
And this is the second time we've asked this particular question. How does this result compare to the previous time?
It's changed quite a bit. I guess unsurprisingly, you know, we asked this same question about a year ago and the numbers fell then pretty evenly. So it was sort of roughly 1/3 for each of those people. Donald Trump was slightly higher than the other two, but, you know, it fell pretty evenly. So there's been a pretty big shift in that sense where people are paying much more attention to Donald Trump and I think, you know, reacting really to the reality of what he's doing in the world.
I'm interested in whether or not this is sort of isolated to Trump himself and, you know, the Trump administration, or whether Australians' views of the alliance, the US relationship overall is changing. Do we have any information on that?
Yeah, look, I think we do because we also asked Australians a couple of questions about the alliance and sort of how they feel about Australian foreign policy more broadly. So we asked the question of whether people think Australia's interests are better served by a more independent foreign policy or a closer alliance with the United States. And 59% chose a more independent foreign policy compared to 23% who chose a closer alliance with the United States. Now, it's difficult to, you know, you can't necessarily untangle that from what Donald Trump is doing because people are, of course, answering this question in the context of Donald Trump. But I think especially in the commentariat and by other kind of foreign policy folk, there's a real effort to separate Donald Trump from the broader alliance. You know, there's this idea that he is hopefully, I guess, temporary. And so you have to think of them as two different things. Like, you know, it's that classic line that the alliance is above presidents or prime ministers. But I think these numbers are reflective of a broad understanding that you can't necessarily do that in a neat way and that Donald Trump is actually quite dramatically changing the United States and how it behaves in the world. And that's not just going to, I guess, revert back to normal. You know, he's changing things quite radically.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the argument that you've been making since the start of the show. I mean, certainly since Trump was reelected, Trump is radically reshaping the institutions of the United States. And, you know, because he was elected in a second time, that at some level, the United States populace doesn't want a status quo option.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And again, you know, I think that's reflected in these numbers. You know, Donald Trump has been actively threatening alliances. You know, he's pretty much ended the NATO alliance. He's literally threatened to invade one of the United States NATO allies in Greenland. And so Australians are responding, I think, to that new reality. And so we asked as well, you know, do you think that the United States is a reliable or unreliable security ally for Australia? Again, you know, you can't necessarily separate out Trump and the broader alliance, but only 13% of Australians said that they thought the United States was a very reliable ally. And that's, you know, again, these are pretty significant numbers. More Australians thought that the United States was unreliable than thought it was a reliable ally. And again, that's just a reflection of reality. And I think an acknowledgement, you know, as you were just saying, that this is bigger than just one individual.
Yeah, and I mean, you get the sense that the Trump administration, the longer that it sticks around, however long that might be, the more significant that damage becomes and the more long lasting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it is. I mean, it seems to me that this is a fairly catastrophic loss of trust that can't just be fixed overnight. You know, Americans, especially American foreign policy types, they love to obsess over American credibility and see that as one of the most important things, which is, you know, very American. It's about image and about how you're seen. But it's not just a matter of kind of rebuilding credibility with the election, you know, of a more stable president as it was with the election of Joe Biden after the first Trump administration. Like, I think these numbers reflect a recognition that that's just not what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, it was pretty clear after Trump got reelected for a second time. Like, as you say, Joe Biden was in lots of ways a very status quo candidate, and they gave him a turn. They tried it. The US people tried it and clearly didn't want it. You know, like, obviously there are extenuating circumstances there with Joe Biden, but if they wanted status quo, you know, Kamala Harris in lots of ways was that option as well. And, you know, the way that the electoral laws are changing now, and the idea that things are going to go back to the way they were, it's just less likely, it just even structurally.
Yeah, absolutely. When there's a deliberate and so far apparently very successful effort underway to restructure the American electoral map exactly as you describe. And when you put that alongside the fact that the Democrats are also historically unpopular, and aside from, you know, some obvious individuals as a party are not offering a real alternative to Trump that is appealing to Americans. Like, as you say, you know, there is no returning to the United States that we thought we knew.
So I want to get into AUKUS. That is, for many people, I suppose, the most obvious and, you know, potentially the most expensive example of how the relationship, the alliance, particularly on a defence kind of level, works. What are Australians telling us about their views on the AUKUS submarine deal?
Yeah, so we asked Australians about the AUKUS submarine deal and whether they think pursuing it is in Australians' interests. And we've asked this question before, of course. 33%, so, you know, a third-ish of Australians said that no, or the AUKUS submarine deal is not in Australia's interests, which is up 7% on the same answer in October last year. And 29%, so about, you know, relatively similar numbers, still don't know or are not sure about the deal and whether it's in Australia's interest, which is relatively high for this kind of question. And 38% have said that they are in favour. So these numbers are, you know, I think we can say that they're moving when it's up 7% on the nose since October. And again, you know, I think that's just in response to the reality of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this question was asked after it was revealed that 3 Australian sailors were on board a US nuclear-powered submarine that sank an Iranian warship off the coast of Sri Lanka in the early days of the Iran war, in the early kind of week or so of the Iran war. Is that correct?
It was. And we actually asked specifically about that incident. So we put to the people we were polling that the Australian Prime Minister had recently confirmed that there were Australian crew on that US submarine that sank the Iranian ship. And we asked them if they thought Australian crew should be embedded on American submarines under US command. 46% said no, they shouldn't be there. 29% said yes, and 25% said they weren't sure. I guess the number that stood out to me was we also have the results broken down by voting intention, and 52% of Labor voters said that no, Australians should not be on US submarines. So I think, without wanting to draw too much out of these numbers, it's fairly clear that Australians are unconvinced by the AUKUS submarine deal, or they're not sure about it. And it does seem to me that the more Australians know, or the more is revealed about this deal, the more uncertain we become about the nature of it. And I think, we should also put that in the context of the significant lack of support for Trump and Netanyahu's war on Iran. 68% of Australians were opposed to Australian involvement in that war, so an overwhelming majority.
So we had a really great question from a listener, Lara on Blue Sky. Is there a poll number that would prompt Labor to scrap AUKUS? It seems like a complete vacuum of democracy on this policy. And I think that's a really great question because it goes to, I suppose, what this polling all means and what it means for the prospects for change.
Yeah, it's such a great question from Lara, and it's one I think about all the time, and we talk all the time about the distinct lack of democratic accountability in foreign policy, not just in Australia, but in the United States as well, where, in both countries, the executive can effectively decide to go to war without consulting elected bodies, without any kind of democratic accountability. So unfortunately, Lara, I think the answer to that question is, I guess either I don't know what the polling number could be, like how high would it have to be for that deal to be scrapped? We're not likely to get 100% opposition, and even if we did, is that going to be enough, or is the government just going to say, well, we are going to pursue what we believe is in Australia's national interests, and do that whole thing about that foreign policy, national security thing that people love to do, and say, well, you don't understand, you don't know, because we have all this secret knowledge and we're doing this in Australia's best interests, and it's best that you don't know, and that this isn't scrutinised. I mean, I suspect that is the case, and at the moment, that's happening not just in foreign policy. The Australia Institute's done polling on things like gambling reform, where there is overwhelming, comprehensive support for gambling reform, and the government hasn't moved on it. There's also, of course, huge support for taxing gas and taxing Australian gas exports, and the government's not moving on that. So, it's doesn't appear to be willing to move on poll numbers, even in kind of relatively safe political terrain like gambling reform, for example. So we don't have much reason to think that it would do that in foreign policy. And, again, that unfortunately, that would be historically consistent. I came of age politically during the protests against Australian involvement in the Bush administration's war on Iraq, where there was overwhelming opposition to Australian involvement in that war. There was overwhelming opposition across the world, in some of the biggest demonstrations the world had seen to that date, and didn't change the decision of a government. They went anyway against a democratic upswell of opposition, and, viewed in the long term against, I think, Australia's security interests. So I'm sorry, Lara. that's a depressing answer to the question, but unfortunately, that is the way the system is set up at the moment, where those kinds of decisions can be made without democratic accountability, without democratic scrutiny. But it's worth emphasising that that's not inevitable. That can change.
So, what do you think would change things? I mean, that's suppose the overriding question for this series,
Yeah.
right?
Is how does foreign policy become more accountable, more responsive, I guess, to the democratic interests of Australians? I mean, again, like I wish I knew.
We're
I think
trying. We're trying.
Yeah, we're trying really hard. Look, I think in that sense, Donald Trump is an opportunity, right? Because opposition to the way that foreign policy is done is, I think, swelling around Donald Trump and the alliance in particular. And that opposition is reflected, according to reporting that I've read, within the Labor caucus, particularly since Israel's war on Gaza and the genocide in Gaza. There's been much more attention on the importance of international law, the importance of, democratic values embedded in international law. So, I think there is that groundswell building outside of Parliament, inside the Labor Party. And I think change is entirely possible that way. But, I guess to flip what I just said earlier, change isn't inevitable. There are certainly interests who are coalescing around locking down foreign policy, locking down AUKUS, doubling down on Australia's alliance with the United States. But, they're worried, like they're getting annoyed at people paying attention to foreign policy and national security.
Yeah, and I mean the heroic effort of some in the foreign policy commentariat, foreign policy community to separate out what's going on with Trump from the overall relationship, from the overall alliance.
Yeah.
Trying to make the case that the United States isn't going to be an unreliable ally for us. Not for us. We're different.
Yeah, we're special. Yeah.
Yeah. Are we different to Canada? Are we different to Greenland?
I
don't know. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, President Trump has directed U.S. Central Command to restart the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz under the umbrella of Project Freedom.
It could happen any day. And it might not happen, but it could happen any day. I believe they want the deal more than I do.
I want to move now to the war in Iran. What's the latest there? It seems from the outside like Trump is just cutting and running, or at least trying to, not succeeding.
Yeah. I think that's, what he wants to do. He wants to talk about the ballroom and be able to say that he's won in Iran, whether, in reality he has or not. So there's been a lot of light and noise around Iran and a potential peace agreement, again, in the last couple of days, in the last couple of weeks. But pretty much it's as, our colleague Alan said on this show, what was it, a couple of weeks ago, that not much has changed. There's really a stalemate. There's no incentive for the Iranian regime to let go of control of the Strait of Hormuz. The US under Trump is engaged in maximalist aims, keeps changing the goalposts and has no interest in committing, to the genuine diplomacy that would be needed to find a way out. So really, again, light and noise, but materially not much has changed.
Yeah. And is the same true of Israel's war on Lebanon? I mean, it seems like, the ceasefire is on again, off again, if it was ever really on.
Yeah. I mean, if it was ever really on, I think is the question. Netanyahu and Trump, for what it's worth, keep saying that, the ceasefire is in place, but Israeli strikes killed more Lebanese people over the weekend. Strikes continue. There have been strikes on Iran for the same reason. And Trump literally went on ABC and said the ceasefire is still in place. This was just a love tap. So I mean, it's so gross. When is a ceasefire not a ceasefire is the question. When strikes are still ongoing, Trump is still threatening to use overwhelming force if the Iranians don't do what he wants, which changes all the time. And people are being subject to extraordinary, or I guess maybe ordinary now, suffering as a result of that.
Yeah. So before we move on to kind of the last part of the show, we talked last week about the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act and what that might mean for, I guess, the US electoral system and US democracy more broadly. There have been some developments on that story. What's the latest with these attempts to redistrict?
So as we talked about last week, a bunch of states have already begun redistricting, effectively gerrymandering Democratic seats out of existence and quite deliberately disenfranchising African American voters in particular in places like Louisiana, in places like Alabama, and then Democratic efforts to counter that redistricting, which has been happening obviously for quite a while, even before this Supreme Court decision, are also facing obstruction by Republican courts. So there was an effort to redistrict in Virginia that was approved. It was put to voters in Virginia and they approved of that redistricting that was then struck down by a conservative Supreme Court in Virginia. So the court system, I think, it's increasingly obvious that court system is, totally in sway with the Trump administration across a number of levels and is interested in influencing the midterms in that way and holding on to power. So, there are a lot of moving parts. Of course, the midterms are still quite a while away and we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but it's not great.
We're coming to the end of this episode and, it is our 100th.
Mm.
And I just wanted to take some time, I suppose, to reflect on all of the crazy stuff that's happened
Yeah,
in the last
bits happened.
couple of years. We launched this, I think, on the 1st of July, 2024. So there's been an election and you're in the United States for the last couple of weeks of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a wild ride since Trump's come into office as well. How does it feel to have been right, Emma?
Fucking sucks. I mean, look, I think I would say that none of this was difficult to predict. If you spend time thinking about observing US politics and US history, it was clear from 2024 and even before, that there was a very real possibility that Trump would come back, that he would ride those waves of American history all the way back into the White House. So it's like we use the phrase shocking but not surprising all the time. And I think the same is true of what's happening in US politics more broadly, much in the way that experts warned what would happen if the United States attacked Iran, that, people who pay attention, who study this, could predict, like with a reasonable level of certainty, what might happen. I think the same is true of US politics. And for whatever reason, institutionally across democracies, not just in Australia, but across the traditional allies of the United States, that's been something that's apparently impossible, to predict and plan for and then deal with. And that is, I guess, either those institutions within governments didn't see it coming or they did and warned governments and governments didn't do anything about it. I'm not even sure what's worse, but it's dangerous, certainly, for the traditional allies of the United States.
Yeah, and I wanted to get to some of the, I suppose, criticism of the concept as well, of the After America concept. We do see a bit of it and it's often seems to fall into that kind of false binary that we talk about all the time, that you talk about all the time.
Mm.
This idea that somehow you're arguing that we have to completely jettison the United States, or that the only choices are totally go with the United States all the way with the USA, or total abandonment.
Yep.
Like, there's a little kind of peek behind the scenes. At the beginning of this series, before we launched it, you and I actually had different ideas for the title. I wanted to call it something else. Was another classic Emma Shortis being right situation.
And really stubborn.
Your words, not mine. But I suppose, we don't usually want to talk about ourselves during the show, but I wanted to ask you about that title and kind of explain what that actually means and what the idea of After America means to you.
I guess I always thought with the potential second election of Donald Trump that if that were to happen, that would represent a pretty radical shift in what the United States is and how it behaves in the world. And again, that's not particularly insightful. That was obvious just from what Donald Trump was saying. And I guess that led me to After America, in that, particularly viewed from Australia, viewed from the traditional allies of the United States, the America that we were used to, the America that we thought we knew, whether we thought that was good or bad or somewhere in between, that was gone and that wasn't coming back. Donald Trump, the Trump administration, the movement that supported him would change that quite radically, which is not to say that there is a historical break, right? We talked a lot about how Donald Trump is the product of American history, and the movement that supports him in particular is the product of American history. That's obvious, in the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act. This has been a project of conservative and far-right America really since, not just the civil rights movement, but the end of the Civil War. A civil war that movement lost but fought in order to preserve the institution of slavery, right? Those parts of America still exist. I'm not suggesting that they are going away, but they are ascendant. And that means a different version of America, a different version of post-World War II America is what we are dealing with. And so we have no choice really but to face a world that is after America. That doesn't mean America doesn't exist. It means it's playing a radically different role to the one we've been used to since the end of the Second World War. And that's true, I think, regardless of what happens next. Even if Donald Trump goes away tomorrow, even if the Trump movement loses power and something else emerges in its place, there's no going back to a previous version of America. It's something different. It's potentially an even more insular America that's seeking to rebuild its own institutions of democracy and focus on fixing its own quite significant problems and entrenched inequality. And in doing so is changing its role in the world dramatically. Even if in the, I guess, most radical imagining of a different United States where a social democratic movement emerges triumphant, much as it has in New York, which is a harder scenario to imagine, but it's not impossible. That's also a radically different version of the United States that we, will have to rework our relationship with. And so, I think the title stands up kind of whatever happens. We do have to grapple with a world after America, after the version of America that we are used to. And that in many ways is an opportunity. If we are willing collectively to break out of those like really fucking tired old binaries of, it's either America, as you say, or it's nothing, or where it's abandonment. And I think, as we've said, over and over again, to recalibrate our relationship with the United States. So it is based on shared democratic values. On some days it's pretty hard to imagine that we might seize that opportunity. It's pretty easy to...
we did have a question from Alison on Instagram asking, how do you not lose hope / get incredibly frustrated about everything?
I am incredibly frustrated. Hopefully that comes through sometimes that, it is incredibly frustrating when institutions and commentary is so stuck in old ways of thinking, like despite what we think is a fairly obvious reality that things are changing and we have to adapt. But I guess, therein lies that opportunity, right? That, we do have this historic opportunity to rethink, the way we behave in the world, our collective institutions of international law. And I mean, I hope that's not a naive hope. I would frame it as actually a historian colleague of mine in the States frames it as radical hope. That it's based in an understanding of what we face and how dangerous it is, but in that lies a radical hope that, collectively things can change. So there is, there's always hope. There has to be. Like, what's the alternative?
Well, Emma, I think that's a really nice and uncharacteristically hopeful note on which to end our 100th episode. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. And congratulations on 100 episodes to you too.
And you. Thank you so much for listening to our 100th episode of After America. Whether you're a new listener or if you've been here from the beginning, we really appreciate your time so much. It means a lot to us both that you spend half an hour with us or so each week to tune in. This show is really important to both of us. And yeah, it just means the world. If you want to read more about the polling we've just talked about or any other Australia Institute research and analysis, whether that's on gas or this week's federal budget and much more, you can find it at australiainstitute.org.au. And if you'd like to get in contact, you can reach us at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 11th of May. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation, and we'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.